Any other questions up to this point? Great. Okay. Now we're going to move on to the Counter-Reformation, though. The Counter-Reformation, in your history textbook, in the Vaughn's textbook, he places the Counter-Reformation as really starting with the Council of Trent. I don't think that's inaccurate, but what I would say to that is actually there was an impulse towards having a council like the Council of Trent even decades before it occurred. The council almost began in the 1530s, for example, and didn't happen because people felt like that the location that was chosen wasn't politically safe. There were all kinds of reasons why it didn't happen sooner. It could have happened sooner, all right? But really, the Counter-Reformation starts almost on the back of the Reformation, and we see from the discourse, proponents of Catholicism, as in like the Catholicism of Rome, talking about the same issues as Luther and Melanchthon and so forth at the same time. But I'm really going to be focusing on what happens with the Council of Trent and what happens after the Council of Trent. So this is, I don't want to set you up with something and then completely derail it. This is what Vaughn's and Stolba and Burkholder and so all these guys who have written histories of music put forward as what happened after the Council of Trent in music. And to a certain extent, these things, yeah, they did happen. Did they happen because of the Council of Trent? No. But I'm going to go through them anyways. All right. First of all, what we see, at least by the end of the 16th century, if not with the Council of Trent itself, but by the end of the 16th century, there is a strong push to get rid of tropes. Do you guys know what tropes are? Okay, can somebody just remind really quick?
This is like adding in, you take a period, a part of a song or something, in the middle of it, you add thank you God, I love you so very much,
right, in
Latin or some, that kind of phrase, and then you continue on with the rest of the song.
Right, exactly. That's a great example. Yeah. Okay, so there's a strong push to get rid of these tropes. Another thing, a lot of the sequences, you guys talked about sequence, you guys probably talked about sequences, right? Like the Dies Irae. A lot of sequences were composed in the medieval era, and especially in the late medieval era, a lot of sequences were added. And the attitude of 16th century theologians, especially Catholic theologians, was that this material was somehow becoming decadent. These were very long pieces. They're very, there's a lot of poetic value, a lot of artistic value to these pieces, and they felt that these pieces, for different reasons, were detracting from the main message of, more long-standing liturgical texts and texts like you see in the Ordinary of the Mass. And so all but 4 of these were eliminated. The 4 that were kept are, 4 of the ones that really have the longest history, but not necessarily. And some of these are ones by, really leading church fathers, and so they were kept. But these are, the Victime Paschalis Laudes, this is an Easter sequence, Veni Sancti Spiritus, Laude Zion, that has attachments with Corpus Christi, and Dies Irae as a piece that was used for death masses and so forth. So these are the ones that get kept. I will say, and I hate to derail this, there is discussion about getting rid of these things, but I've seen prints from the 80s that still include just tons and tons of other sequences. So I don't think this is really such an important point from what the Counter-Reformation was trying to do and not do, but it does happen. You do see that these eventually fade away. And to this day, you don't really get any more composition of sequence beyond these 5 and also the Stabat Mater. Okay. The use of secular music in sacred works is discouraged. This is absolutely true. This is something that, very rapidly after the Council of Trent, you see a falling away of pieces like, the L'Homme Armé. You guys probably talked about the L'Homme Armé. You don't see these sort of secular texts featuring as Cantus Firmi in masses anymore. And in general, actually, we begin to see kind of a falling away from the use of the Cantus Firmus in general, very large. And also a decreased use of polyphony. I made a note here, this is part of a larger scale trajectory. I wouldn't say that this is as much a religious push, although I will read you guys a text in a moment that talks about the value of text and of hearing and understanding texts. I'll get to you in 1 second. But this is something that we've actually seen even moving away from the end of the medieval era with, where you get, 5 voice works with, lots of them have a different text in them and nobody can really understand anything. This isn't something that's completely a novel concept of the Renaissance. Yeah?
I was going to ask, is the decreased use of polyphony, not really a regression, but a return to more monophony or towards homophonic texture?
This is a great question. what I'm referring to here is more of a push towards homophonic textures, but actually at the end of the Renaissance you see a huge number of monophonic prints. The number of chant prints in the late 16th century is just gargantuan. And actually Palestrina, who I'll talk about, was lauded as the savior of polyphony, was actually better known in his day for his work with chant. Crazy times, right? What else? Any other questions up until this point? Yeah.
Great, so you're saying the Council of Trent was the only aspect of the Counter-Reformation? Like, is the books, you make it seem like it was like the defining moment. They said, okay, we're going to change things now, but you're saying that that wasn't really it. I'm a little confused.
When it comes to discussion of Catholic doctrine and what the Catholic Church, how the Catholic Church was responding to Protestantism in the early 16th century, the Council of Trent is it. When it comes to talking about what impacted the way, the kind of trajectories music was taking at this time, the Council of Trent really doesn't have so much to say about music. And
It's like a ripple effect.
yeah, exactly. And so
Okay.
like what we do see is actually later, the people who came to be kind of the generation after the Council of Trent, who were trying to put the Council of Trent doctrine into practice. Those people take a lot of interest in music, and it's actually these concepts that we take away as being pushed by the Council of Trent were actually put forward by those people who were executing what they interpreted as, the Council's desire. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to undermine the importance of the Council of Trent in the 16th century. That was the most important council of the 16th century to talk about issues of doctrine. Great question. Any other questions up until this point? Okay. All right, it would be really, like, the council met for a long period of time. They talked about a lot of things. It published a lot of texts. It would be impossible to go through in detail all of the things that they talked about. But I did want to give you a sense of some of the main topics, and also something about the trajectory that this, that the debate took. So they met over the course of 3 different periods. They met in Trent, which is where that name comes from. During the first session, which began in 1545, ended in 1547, what you see is really theological concepts and sacraments get a lot of attention in this first session. The Eucharist gets an especial amount of attention. I really want to stress that. This was like one of the most, also among Protestants, one of the most hotly contested subjects, especially issues such as justification, which is related to the Eucharist, the idea of the transubstantiation, which is related to the Eucharist. These were really the central pivot points of debate, and points on which, in fact, some people said, if one side or the other could be a little flexible about these issues, we could probably come back together, but it didn't happen. And so I can't emphasize enough how important the discussion of the Eucharist was, both by Protestants and by Catholics. Also, we get a discussion of books and traditions in this session. Which books the Catholic Church is going to keep, what needs to happen with those books. These are like the Vulgate, the Breviary, and so forth. In the second session, sacraments get a special attention, even more so than in the first session. The Eucharist becomes the centralized point of discussion, but very few decrees are published because nobody could agree on anything. Somebody got assassinated, the thing just like blew up in everybody's face. Like it just ended in a catastrophe. Everybody basically fled. You can see that there was this huge gap between when that second session ended and when the third one began. Nobody could agree on that issue. They were trying to talk about some of the most, even amongst Catholics who were present at that council, they still couldn't agree on exactly how they wanted to talk about that concept and what they wanted to put forward as official doctrine. Let me also stress, though, and coming back to your question about, what was Protestantism its own religion? No, definitely not, because the people that participated in this council were not, you couldn't safely call them all card-carrying Catholics. This was a council that was open to theologians and, people of authority, and it wasn't in any way blocking participation from people who had, had some sort of Protestant leaning. In fact, a lot of the people who went there had really quite a diversity of ideas about faith. All right, so coming back finally in 1562, the council reconvened. By this point, all kinds of conflicts have happened. Emperor Charles V put out a decree really right around the end of this session saying nobody can talk about doctrine anymore until this council decides something. And it just became this this weird explosion of conflict, and, finally comes back together in 1562, however, and the guy who was the president of that last session really took much more an interest in focusing on practical issues. He wanted to just get the thing done. He does talk about some of the same, he does bring in issues of sacraments again, but a lot of the, the way that those are talked about are, what's the responsibility of the different holy orders with respect to those things? And, can everybody take the chalice, or is the bread enough? Like, they're very, very practical matters, and they're things that he felt, this was Ercole Gonzaga. There were things that he felt, maybe we can at least not have an assassination this time and decide on something and be done. And so these concerns down here, how to educate people who are preaching, how to, who gets to preach where, who gets to do it. Really practical matters, and that's where the council ends. Any questions about that general discussion? You can see that they kind of talked about everything though, right? Or at least they tried to. What is the counter? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
With the people attending these, they were kind of spread apart. Would they have mostly been the same theologians attending all of these councils, or did it kind of shift in terms of people?
Yeah, I mean, there were councils held. There were councils held in what were becoming